is an impressive saltwater crocodile, Crocodilus parisis, measuring 17 feet 11 inches, 5.48 meters, and weighing an estimated 2,200 pounds, 998 kilograms. Captured in 1984 in Australia's Northern Territory, Cassius was known as a problematic crocodile, attacking boats and posing a risk to people and livestock. Named after the legendary boxer Cassius Clay, better known as Muhammad Ali, he was transported to Marineland Melanesia, a wildlife park on Green Island in Queensland, where he has since thrived in a spacious and naturalistic enclosure. Cassius has become a major attraction, drawing visitors eager to see one of the world's largest crocodiles. His survival in captivity serves as a testament to the importance of conservation and rehabilitation, with his story highlighting the successful efforts to protect these formidable creatures. Recognized by Guinness World Records in 2011 as the largest living crocodile in captivity, Cassius remains a symbol of the impressive power and resilience of crocodiles, even as he ages beyond 100 years. Gustav, the third largest crocodile documented, is a Nile crocodile, Crocodilus niloticus, with an almost mythical status in Burundi's Rusizi River and Lake Tanganyika. Although his exact measurements are unknown, Gustav is estimated to be 17 to 18 feet, 5.18 to 5.49 meters, long and weigh about 2,000 pounds, 907 kilograms. Unlike Lolling and Cassius, Gustav has never been captured and remains a wild creature with a fearsome reputation. He is rumored to be responsible for over 100 human deaths, adding to his near-legendary status. Numerous experts and filmmakers have attempted to study Gustav, and herpetologist Patris Fay has spent years tracking him. Despite attempts to capture him in 2002, Gustav has evaded every effort, reinforcing his mystique. His story underscores the respect and caution humans must exercise with large crocodiles, especially where human and crocodile habitats intersect. Brutus, a saltwater crocodile, measuring around 18 feet, 5.5 meters, and weighing nearly 2,000 pounds, 707 kilograms, resides in the Adelaide River of Australia's Northern Territory. Brutus is a favorite on jumping crocodile tours where visitors can see him leaping from the water. Distinctively missing a front leg, likely lost in a fight, Brutus demonstrates the resilience of these ancient creatures. His popularity emphasizes the importance of ecotourism in promoting respect for wildlife, with these experiences fostering awareness and appreciation for crocodiles and their natural habitat. Bujang Senang, the fifth largest documented crocodile, was a saltwater crocodile, measuring about 19 feet, 5.8 meter, and weighing around 1,865 pounds, 846 kilograms. Known in Malaysian folklore as a transformed human warrior, Bujang Senang became a legendary figure due to attacks attributed to him. Following an attack on a woman in 1992, authorities hunted him down, and his preserved remains now serve as a testament to the awe-inspiring power of these creatures at the Sarawak Museum. Yai, a Siamese crocodile, Crocodilus siamensis, is the sixth largest, recorded at 18 feet, 5.5 meters, and approximately 1,800 pounds, 816 kilograms. He resides in Thailand's Samut Prakan Crocodile Farm, a conservation center for endangered species. Born in captivity, Yai has helped raise awareness of the threats facing Siamese crocodiles and highlights the importance of captive breeding for endangered crocodile species. Dominator, another massive saltwater crocodile from Australia's Adelaide River, is estimated to be 20 feet, 6.1 meters, long and weigh around 1,760 pounds, 800 kilograms. Like Brutus, Dominator is a free-roaming crocodile often observed on jumping crocodile tours. His size and wild status make him a testament to the power and allure of these reptiles, with responsible ecotourism providing a sustainable way to admire these animals in their natural setting. Each of these extraordinary crocodiles represents a unique chapter in the story of human interaction with these powerful predators. As we continue exploring the world's largest crocodiles, we must remember the significance of conservation and responsible wildlife management. These creatures are essential to biodiversity and deserve our respect, protection, and admiration for future generations. The story of Dominator reflects the delicate balance between human interests and wildlife needs, especially in areas where large predators like crocodiles live. As we explore the world's largest crocodiles, it's essential to foster coexistence between humans and crocodiles, while also establishing conservation strategies that protect these awe-inspiring animals and their habitats. Dominator's ongoing presence in the Adelaide River serves as a poignant reminder of the value of respecting and preserving the natural world. Through responsible tourism and public engagement, we can ensure crocodiles like Dominator thrive in the wild, continuing to inspire future generations with their strength, size, and undeniable majesty. Documented as the 8th largest crocodile, Kalia is an impressive saltwater crocodile, Crocodilis pursus residing in Bhitarkanika National Park in Odisha, India. Estimated to be about 20 feet, 6.1 meters, long and weighing 1,700 pounds, 771 kg, Kalia exemplifies the remarkable size these reptiles can reach in the wild. Bhitarkanika provides a critical sanctuary, with its mangrove forests and network of rivers creating an ideal habitat for large crocodiles to thrive. Kalia's presence underscores the importance of protected areas in conserving crocodile populations and maintaining healthy ecosystems. With careful management and research, Bhitarkanika has successfully preserved habitats for crocodiles while promoting sustainable ecotourism that benefits both local communities and the environment. The 9th largest crocodile, Osceola, is an impressive American crocodile, Crocodilis acutus at the St. Augustine Alligator Farm Zoological Park in Florida, USA. Measuring 19 feet, 5.79 meters, and weighing around 1,600 pounds, 725 kg, Osceola is one of the largest American crocodiles and a major attraction at the park. Originally from South Florida, he was relocated to the park to reduce potential human-wildlife conflicts. In his new home, Osceola has thrived, showcasing the role of zoological parks in protecting large, potentially dangerous animals. These facilities provide safe environments that reduce human-wildlife conflicts and raise awareness about wildlife conservation and responsible management. The 10th largest crocodile recorded, Gomek was an extraordinary saltwater crocodile, Crocodilis pursus that once lived at the St. Augustine Alligator Farm Zoological Park. He measured around 17.8 feet, 5.42 meters, and weighed 1,895 pounds, 860 kg. Originally captured in Papua New Guinea, Gomek eventually became a beloved resident of the park, captivating visitors with his size and intelligence. Known to recognize his keepers, Gomek provided valuable insights into crocodile behavior and cognitive abilities. His legacy lives on through exhibits at the park, educating visitors about the importance of crocodile conservation and the role of these creatures in ecosystems. The 11th largest crocodile, Jaws III, is a saltwater crocodile, Crocodilis, Banks Cruston Center for Herpetology in Chennai, India. Measuring 17.6 feet, 5.36 meters, and weighing 1,500 pounds, 680 kg, Jaws III is a significant attraction at the facility. Originally found in the Andaman Islands, he was relocated to the Crocodile Bank, where he contributes to research, conservation, and education efforts. The Crocodile Bank is one of the world's largest crocodile breeding centers, hosting over 2,400 crocodiles. Jaws II's presence highlights the need for wildlife conservation and responsible management in preserving these incredible creatures. As the 12th largest crocodile, Cassius is a saltwater crocodile, Crocodilis pursus residing at Marineland Melanesia in Green Island, Australia. Measuring 17.1 feet, 5.21 meters, and weighing around 1,300 pounds, 590 kg, Cassius is also one of the oldest known crocodiles, estimated to be over 110 years old. Captured in 1984 due to his size and aggressive nature, Cassius's ongoing health reflects the exceptional care provided by Marineland. His story emphasizes the role of conservation centers in preserving aging crocodiles and increasing understanding of their lifespans. The 13th largest crocodile, Pointe Noire, is a Nile crocodile, Crocodilis niloticus from the Republic of Congo. At 17 feet, 5.18 meters, and weighing about 1,250 pounds, 567 kg, Point Noir demonstrates the formidable size Nile crocodiles can reach. Found near human settlements, his story underlines the importance of minimizing human-wildlife conflicts in areas where these powerful reptiles live. Through education and awareness, it's possible to encourage coexistence while safeguarding vital ecosystems where crocodiles like Point Noir thrive. Ranking as the 14th largest, Tawi Tawi is a saltwater crocodile, Crocodilis paresis from Tawi province in the Philippines, measuring 16.7 feet, 5.1 meters, and weighing about 1,200 pounds, 544 kg. Tawi Tawi's discovery in the Philippines highlights the presence of large crocodile populations in the area, where respectful wildlife management and ongoing research are crucial to preserve these impressive reptiles and promote understanding of their ecosystems. The 15th largest crocodile, Maniac, is a saltwater crocodile, Crocodilis paresis at the Corona Crocodile Farm in Queensland, Australia. Measuring 16.4 feet, 5 meters, and weighing around 1,100 pounds, 500 kg, Maniac was relocated to the farm after posing potential threats to humans and livestock in his original habitat. Established in 1981, the Corona Crocodile Farm combines commercial farming with conservation, using exhibits like Maniac to educate visitors on crocodile biology and conservation. Through such efforts, farms like Corona promote the coexistence of humans and crocodiles and underscore the ecological importance of these ancient animals. As we continue exploring the world's largest crocodiles, it's crucial to acknowledge the efforts of individuals, organizations, and conservation centers dedicated to the survival of these awe-inspiring reptiles. Through education, research, and wildlife management, we can deepen our respect for crocodiles and ensure their survival for future generations to appreciate.